So I want to introduce Isadora McCullough. She is uh, an engineer working at, oh my gosh, it just
Agilent.
Agilent. Yeah. And Agilent is a biotech company. And so she'll just talk a little bit about her experiences and we'll answer any questions that you have. So
Yes.
let, let's
And
let her
sorry I
talk.
missed it the last time. I can't believe it.
They didn't even know.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, it's been so October is the end of fiscal year for Agilent, so it's been very chaotic. So yeah, so my name is Isadora McCullough. I was born and raised in Brazil, moved to California as an exchange student, then ended up coming back for my degree. I went to Cabrillo College. I got my ASs in engineering and science and chemistry. Took some time off and then transferred to San Jose State as a chemical engineer. And then while at San Jose State, I decided that I didn't want to be in a lab all the time like I thought I did. And I ended up getting a minor in business. And now I am a biopharma market specialist for Agilent. So I still have my technical life. I still have to use a lot of it, but I am also dealing with tons of people and the sales world, life of things. I still have your questions here, so let me go through them. How did I get interested in engineering? So that was one of the questions. So I actually got interested in chemistry first when I was in high school. And in Brazil, you take a test after you graduate from high school to pass to college. So you decide really early kind of what you want to do. So when I was like a freshman, I was between chemistry and like architecture, but I can't draw for the life of me. I don't know where that came from. And then I was like, oh, chemistry. But then more that I look into it and more that I research, it seemed like you just analyzing the same stuff over and over again. And then engineering was, more creative and different projects, and I could expand my career more. So I decided that I wanted to do that. And I wanted to work for a petroleum company in Brazil. That was my biggest dream. So I got my degree, and that's not what I did. But that was the idea when I was a freshman, sophomore in high school. So my passion for engineering has been, I guess since I was younger. Let's see. What else I have to tell you guys? Oh, I lost the question. Sorry. I try to keep on the questions so I don't talk too much. And then why did I choose my field? So I chose chemical engineering because I really loved chemistry. I never really loved physics. I was bummed that I had to take physics. I loved Carlos, and thank God for him. But physics just wasn't my thing. And chemistry was really fun. I really loved it. So I ended up going with chemical engineering. If I went back today, I would look into maybe like biomedical engineering. Seems like something like that I would open my mind to. But I didn't know much of the engineering world when I decided, and I just stuck to it. I just said chemical engineering, like chemistry, that's what's going to be. Even though when you become a junior and a senior, you don't do a lot of chemistry, but still, I just stuck to it. So I did go to San Jose State University. My experience at Cabrillo, it was definitely different than my experience at university. It was, Cabrillo is a smaller school. Everybody's kind of like that family life, hanging out at Mesa. Everybody knows each other. The commute wasn't bad. I lived in Santa Cruz, it was great. So my experience was good. I really enjoyed. I had a hard time, I would say, finding a female support kind of. So then when I got to San Jose State, I started like a woman in engineering sorority for just girls that are engineers, so I could find like a group of people to hang out with, and that helped my networking, helped me get through school and deal with the stress of being a transfer student. Being a transfer student is definitely different because you show up and people have been there since they're freshmen, and you're just trying to find yourself. But I really loved Cabrillo. My classes there were definitely, the professors cared more for me, I would say, than the big classrooms in the university. They were kind of just like, yeah, you're one other person. You have to really, just do your stuff. So my work as an engineer. So like I said, I'm working with sales. So my industry is focused in biopharma, and we sell, Agilent sells a bunch of instruments, but my department sells the chromatography instrumentation. So I work mostly with liquid chromatography instruments because that's very popular in the biopharma world, but we also have the gas chromatography, mass packs, and other instruments that we sell. And I work with customers to find what solution they have, so they need. So they call and they're analyzing an aggregation on, on a monoclonal antibody, and I have to talk to them, go through their process, what kind of separation they're doing, what trying to analyze, what they're trying to find, and then we find the correct configuration of the instrument that works for their lab, and then the correct column that they have to use, and we make something to create the perfect workflow for their lab. So I'm most of the time talking to customers, but also learning a lot. I'm constantly having to keep up because biopharma is such a big industry, it's constantly growing. So I have to always keep up with what's happening. COVID happened, so I had to keep up with that, and you have to keep studying. So I think I mentioned that in your last class. I feel like I study sometimes more now than I did in school, because you have to keep very fresh. And in school, you study something and you take the test and you just kind of in that book. But now it's just like there's information everywhere, and I have competitors that I'm going against, and you have to always know the newest technology or the newest solution out there. So I feel like I'm constantly trying to learn and see what's out on the news. So it can be intense, but it's fun. My favorite project that I worked as an engineer, I didn't do much in chemical engineering, very like process engineering. A lot of the people that I graduated with went towards process engineering. I had my senior project, which is very hands-on. We worked on that. I had a few internships, but I didn't do anything very crazy. I kind of went out of that path as soon as I found out I didn't want to be in a lab. I had a bioengineering lab that we would be there till like 10:30 p.m. and it was fun, but it became exhausting and you can't talk. You got to pay attention to things. And I was like, I really miss people, and they can tell I love to talk. So I was like, I don't know if that's what I want to do. So I started to get jobs more towards sales, technical sales, with the whole technical engineering that some people call under my belt, so I could graduate and have a job. What else? How's my engineering degree impacted my life? As a female, it's amazing to walk around and say I'm an engineer, but impacted me a lot. I think that for some reason people have some different look at you, even though it's just a degree. And I think sometimes if they are not an engineer, they don't realize how much struggle it is and how it's not like we're genius or anything. But there's definitely a different aspect towards things. I think that in my work, people have this idea that I'm good at critical thinking and that I'm a fast learner because of the degree I went through, which I think that's how I ended up getting, my full-time position. I was an intern at Agilent before I got my full-time position. And I think that's a little bit of that. Some of my coworkers have like masters in biology, but not an engineering degree. So sometimes people look towards me expecting me to have some critical thinking or some faster thinking. I also think it helped me just getting paid more. I'm not going to lie. Like, I think that I see some other of my friends that didn't have an engineering degree, and the engineering degrees kind of pay more. So that was a nice thing too. But I think it affected in a lot of ways. It's definitely a good thing to have under your belt. And I didn't get a master's. I didn't get a PhD. I know a lot of people end up doing that as well. But yeah, just having a bachelor's, it makes me feel very special. Okay, so what one suggestion do you have for engineering students on their educational path or their career? My suggestion is network. Go to, LinkedIn, find people and explore, get out of your comfort zone. I would say that I wouldn't be able to learn about sales engineering if I didn't get off of my comfort zone and explore other things and networked and met other people. I remember the last class of yours, Carl, that I attended, one of your students reached out to me to LinkedIn. And I think that's huge, right? Because now I remember his name and I remember what he's looking for. So in the future, if I see something that reminds me of him, I'll be like, oh, this person went there. So it gets you a lot, really far. Like I got an internship because I met a CEO of a company, of a startup in a conference, and she gave me a job, and I didn't really had an interview or anything. So I think the networking is very important. Use Cabrillo as much as you can, you know, the support system that you have, your classes and everything, take all that you can, and be ready for the big image of the university and how the big classrooms know much 101 kind of deal. But then when you get there, try to enjoy and sign up for clubs or other networking opportunities. I think that it really impacted my life and how fast I got a job compared to, you know, some of my colleagues and my classmates. So I think that's a really big thing that I would say. Okay. Did I forget anything? Any questions?
I think we're getting close to one.
¿Cuántos años você tinha quando você se mudou acá?
Sorry, say it again. It was cutting.
Oh, ¿cuántos años você tinha quando você se mudou acá, a Califórnia?
Eu tinha 17 anos. I was 17 when I moved here.
Okay. And what city are you from in Brazil? Sao Paulo?
No, I'm from Rio de Janeiro.
Okay.
Like Americans say, Rio de Janeiro. I'm
Yeah.
from Janeiro.
Eu conheço o Rio.
Yeah, I love it. Did you like it?
Yeah. So you're what's the word? Carioca. Yeah.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah, I love Brazil. I wish that it wasn't so tough. You know, definitely getting an education in America was my idea of having a better life there. And then a fun fact, I ended up meeting my husband in an engineering 5 class, and I stayed here. You know, years and years ago. So, but yeah, the idea was to go back. I miss home. I go as much as I can. Not now with COVID. I was supposed to be there in the summer, but this whole thing happened. But yeah, it's a great place. If you guys in the line never been, and after this whole is done, make sure you take a trip there. It's a good place.
So other questions out there? I have one, which is,
okay.
It sounds like part of your, I mean, I think it works with your personality is naturally exudes this kind of leadership and grabbing people and getting people to do things, right? And it seems like I know from my experience in the engineering field that is a pretty rare quality. And I can see why, you know, like taking advantage of things like starting clubs and doing those things, that anything that's within your control at different levels of your kind of college experiences really helps cultivate that, that ownership and that willingness to take on and try to make something happen. And I just want to emphasize to everyone in this class, like, it doesn't always have to look exactly the same. You know, it doesn't always have to be like sort of the get people together, but that idea that what you really want when you're hiring an engineer is someone that if you gave them their own time, like if you gave them time off, they would make something cooler than when you try to tell them what to do. You know, it's kind of that, that internal piece that, of creation and like interest and, you know, how that all fits together. So really don't be shy in that way. Like, have some pride in your ideas and your efforts and recognize that all those things add up to all the times you did something that no one needed you or expected you or asked you to do, but you did it anyway because it was cool to you. Those are the kinds of things that will always be recognized, even if they don't fit exactly in the networking zone or something else. But that thing that was like, wow, what made you make that? It was just like, I just wanted to. And so definitely follow your passions as much as you can within the industry. And where you have that energy and that flow. I know this is really more of a sermon, I guess, than a question, but is it?
No, I completely
Yeah.
agree with you. I completely agree with you. I think that I do hear that a lot. Oh, you're very like outgoing for an engineer, right? And I think that I was always an outgoing person, and moving here and having English as a second language, I became a little shy of speaking because of the accent and all that stuff, right? And then when I got to San Jose State, I definitely, creating the sorority made me more outgoing, right? So I kind of went outside my box, and I came back to this old me that loves to be, in front of people and talking. But that was my passion, right? I'm passionate for people. I'm passionate to meet new people and have conversations. So I totally agree with you. And I think a good example is within the sorority, it's because it's a professional sorority, right? We had a lot of events and resumes and things like that. And I remember the best advice that they give was exactly what you're talking about. Like some students saying, I don't have an internship, or I don't have anything to put it on my resume. And they were saying things just like, your side project that you do because you're passionate for it. Just put that on your resume. I had a friend that her resume had like projects, and she just put all her side projects. She made some robot by herself and she wrote it out. And it's funny because when I got interviewed, a lot of the time people would be like, oh, you started a sorority? Tell me about that. And my friend was like, oh, you made this on your own? Just like you're saying, like people get interested because you're competing with people that also went to school, that got the same degree, right? So it's kind of like, what do you have extra outside of that everybody that's in the class with you did that you did? So yeah, I completely agree. Follow your passion, do things on your free time, like studying is great or whatever, but try to find a free time to find your passion and focus on that, because a company also wants you to be yourself, right? Like the most authentic you are, the more chances you have. And I completely agree.
Other questions out there?
So what are some kind of projects that you're working on right now?
Yeah, so with work, I have few non-engineering projects. I have a project I'm teaching. So because of COVID, we're getting new people on the team. So I became a teacher for new people that are coming in about biopharma. So I have every Friday, I have this like project that I created with a colleague, and we teach the national, the whole United States, anybody that's new to Agilent and is going to be working with the instruments, with the biopharma, and learning about, just workflows within biopharma. I had more before COVID because we had the lab and we get to go and see things, but now I've been working from home since March 6th. So a lot of it is just trying to get this communication to work through webcam. So it's different. I don't have much going on besides trying to help people through the PC.
Any other questions out there? All right, well, let's thank Isadora for coming and sharing her experience with us. And hopefully we'll be calling you guys all in about 5-6 years to come speak to an Engineering 5 class.
Yeah, I know, that's fun. I loved it. Thank you for the invite. It's always, nice to see the engineering. And another fun fact, so my husband and I met Engineering 5. It's upstairs right now in another Engineering 5, which my time we only had one. And I was like, wait, there's another one? So he's over there talking to another Engineer 5. But yeah, it's fun. Keep your connections with Cabrillo. You always come back and get to meet people. I don't know how many people are looking into chemical engineering or anything that I can, or San Jose State, feel free to find me on the internet to ask me questions or any help you need. I know it's a weird timing. I would say we can go get a drink or have a cup of coffee, but we can do this, just a one-on-one. Feel free to reach out, and good luck with the whole online classes.
Awesome. Thank you.
Of course. Bye. Have a good night.
See you later.
Bye. De nada.
All right, so let's see. Let's go back to sharing my screen. And our agenda. So where are we? Well,